Tonight on Coffee with Giants, we sit down with Fyodor Dostoevsky to understand suffering and guilt. I'm Joshua Withmore, your host. Welcome to Coffee with Giants. Our guest today is a writer who understood something many people spend their entire lives trying to avoid: suffering. In the modern world, suffering is often treated like a mistake, something that shouldn't happen, something we should eliminate from our lives as quickly as possible. But the man sitting across from me today believed something radically different. He believed suffering may actually be one of the most important experiences in the human journey. Few writers explored the depths of the human soul more fearlessly than the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky, the author of Crime and Punishment, The Brothers Karamazov, and many other works that continue to challenge how we think about guilt, freedom, morality, and redemption. Fyodor, it's an honour to have you here. Let's begin with a question that almost everyone asks at some point in life. Why do we suffer? Many people today feel overwhelmed by suffering, emotionally, psychologically, even spiritually. And yet in your novels, suffering seems to play a very different role. It is painful, yes, but it also seems deeply meaningful. Why is suffering such a central part of the human experience?
Because suffering reveals the truth about the human soul. When life is comfortable, it is very easy for a person to live within illusions. We tell ourselves stories about who we are. We believe we are rational, moral, strong, and in control of our lives. But suffering interrupts those illusions. It forces a confrontation with reality, with our weaknesses, our fears, and sometimes with our moral failures. This is why suffering occupies such an important place in my novels. Not because I glorify pain, but because pain often strips away the lies we tell ourselves. And only when those illusions collapse does a person begin to see clearly.
So suffering is not just something that happens to us. It also reveals something about us. In 1849, you were arrested by the Russian government for participating in intellectual discussions considered politically dangerous. After months in prison, you were sentenced to death. You stood in front of a firing squad. At the last moment, literally seconds before the execution, the sentence was commuted. Instead of death, you were sent to Siberia for years of hard labour. Did your years in Siberia change the way you understood suffering?
Completely. Before Siberia, I believed many of the ideas popular among intellectuals of my time. We believed society could be perfected through reason, through political reform, through rational systems. But prison changes a man. In Siberia, I lived among murderers, thieves, and people society considered monsters. And yet I began to see something unexpected. Even among the worst criminals, there remained a longing for goodness, a longing for forgiveness, a longing for God. I realized that suffering reveals something profound about the human soul. It strips away illusions and forces a person to confront the truth of who he is. And during those years, the only book I had was the New Testament. I read it over and over again. It slowly transformed the way I saw humanity.
That's fascinating because Christ appears in subtle but powerful ways throughout your novels. In Crime and Punishment, the character Sonya reads the story of Lazarus from the New Testament to Raskolnikov, the story of resurrection. Why is that moment so important?
Because Raskolnikov represents the modern intellectual temptation. He believes human beings can redefine morality through reason alone. He convinces himself that certain people, extraordinary individuals, have the right to step beyond traditional moral boundaries. But after he commits murder, something begins to break inside him. No theory can quiet his conscience. No intellectual justification can silence his guilt. What he experiences is something deeply human, the recognition that he has violated not merely a social rule, but a moral truth. When Sonya reads the story of Lazarus, the story of a man raised from the dead, it symbolizes the possibility that even a soul burdened with guilt can be reborn. And this is where Christ enters the story. Christ represents the possibility that redemption is real.
About Sonya. She's one of the most surprising figures in the novel. On the surface, she's a deeply marginalized person. She becomes a prostitute simply to keep her starving family alive. And yet, morally and spiritually, she appears to be one of the purest characters in the entire book. Why did you choose someone like Sonya to play such an important role in Raskolnikov's redemption?
Because the logic of redemption does not follow the logic of social respectability. Society often assumes that moral authority belongs to those who appear outwardly respectable, powerful, or intellectually superior. But the Christian vision turns this idea upside down. Sonya is a person who suffers deeply. She lives in humiliation and poverty. She carries a terrible burden simply to ensure that her younger siblings do not starve. Yet in the midst of this suffering, she preserves something extraordinarily rare: compassion. She does not become bitter. She does not become cruel. Instead, she develops a profound capacity to see the suffering of others. This is why she alone is able to reach Raskolnikov.
That's fascinating because Raskolnikov sees himself as intellectually superior to everyone around him. Yet the person who ultimately confronts him with the truth isn't a philosopher or a judge, it's Sonya.
Yes, because Raskolnikov's deepest problem is not intellectual, it is spiritual. He has isolated himself from humanity through pride. He believes he is extraordinary, beyond ordinary moral law. But Sonya represents something Raskolnikov has completely lost: humility. She does not confront him with arguments, nor does she attempt to defeat his theories the way a philosopher might. Instead, she stands before him with a quiet strength born from suffering, compassion, and faith. In her presence, Raskolnikov encounters something he cannot explain away or defeat with logic. A love that does not condemn him, yet does not excuse his crime. A love that simply refuses to abandon him. And it is precisely this kind of love that begins to break through the walls he has built around his soul.
Today, many people try to escape guilt entirely. We often hear that guilt is unhealthy, that we should simply free ourselves from it. But in your work, guilt seems to be part of the path toward redemption. Why?
Because guilt is the awakening of conscience. Without conscience, a person can justify anything. The modern danger is not suffering itself. The danger is the belief that human beings can live without moral responsibility. Raskolnikov suffers because his conscience refuses to allow him to escape the truth. And paradoxically, that suffering becomes his salvation, because it leads him toward humility, toward confession, toward love. This is deeply connected to the Christian understanding of redemption. Christ does not eliminate suffering. Christ transforms it. Through suffering, pride is broken. Through suffering, the heart becomes capable of compassion. And through suffering, a person may rediscover God.
If someone listening today feels overwhelmed by guilt, shame, or suffering, what would you want them to understand?
I would tell them this: your suffering does not mean your life is ruined. Your guilt does not mean redemption is impossible. In fact, the very ability to feel guilt is evidence that your soul is still alive. The Christian message is radical precisely because it declares that no human being is beyond redemption. Christ entered the world of suffering, not to eliminate it immediately, but to redeem it. And this means that even the darkest experiences can become the beginning of transformation. The question is not whether we suffer. The question is whether suffering will lead us toward despair or toward truth.
Fyodor Dostoevsky reminds us that suffering is not merely something to escape. Sometimes it is the very thing that reveals who we are and who we can become. If today's conversation sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to explore Crime and Punishment. It remains one of the most powerful explorations of guilt, suffering, and redemption ever written. Thank you for joining us on Coffee with Giants. And remember, like Sir Isaac Newton once said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing upon the shoulders of giants."